The President of the United States, Warren Harding, had left D.C. in late June of 1923, traveling all over the country, probably getting ready to announce his bid for a second term. He won his first term by 60%, a landslide which hadn't been seen since over 100 years before in 1820. But now scandal threatened his chances at a second term. Harding confessed to one of his assistants that he thought he was, quote, not fit for this office and should have never been here. So Harding, doubtful of his chances at re-election and full of self-doubt, set off on a voyage of discovery. Harding asked his Secretary of Commerce, future President, Herbert Hoover, that if you knew of a great scandal in our administration, would you, for the good of the country and the party, expose it publicly, or would you bury it? Hoover told the president that he must expose whatever scandal he was worried about. But Harding didn't have the same courage as Hoover, and feared that either way the blame would be put on him. Harding prayed for a way out, but at the same time, thought it was his duty to serve out the rest of his term, as well as a second term too. In the first days of August, Harding was resting in a San Francisco hotel. He had only a few stops more to make along the coast of California, and then he would be back on his way to the White House. But right now, Harding was removed from whatever plans he had for the rest of the day, the rest of the trip, or the rest of his term, as his wife, Florence, read him the most recent copy of the Saturday Evening Post. Just as he asked her to continue reading, Harding shuddered for a moment. He then dropped, straight and dead, into his bed. At first, most thought it was a stroke, but now most think it was a heart attack. Some rumors went around at the time that his wife poisoned him, and those rumors last to this day. But right then, none of that really mattered because the country no longer had a president, and nobody could find the man who was going to take the office Harding had, just moments before, held. For nearly 5 hours, the new president, Calvin Coolidge, could not be found. This was the longest amount of time we had ever went without a president, and every minute was crucial. Calvin was born on the 4th of July, 1872, to John Calvin Coolidge and Victoria Moore. When he was 12 years old, his mother died, and when he was 17, his little sister, his only sibling, died too. Father John Coolidge was devastated, of course, but 6 years after he was made a widower, he remarried to a schoolteacher from Plymouth, Vermont. Calvin graduated from Black River Academy in Vermont in 1890, and shortly after, he enrolled in Amherst College in Massachusetts. At Amherst, he was miserable, but he struggled through and graduated in 1895 with honors. After graduating Amherst, his father wanted him to go to New Hampton to apprentice for a law firm, Hammond & Feld. And in 1897, he was admitted to the Massachusetts bar. In 1898, Calvin started his own office in New Hampton. Calvin was a commercial lawyer, and for his hard work, many local small businesses began looking to him. As he became more and more popular in his community, he ran for city council and won a seat. In the next few years, Coolidge would hold a number of smaller city offices, and in 1904, Coolidge ran for the school board of New Hampton. He lost this election, and though he was very much disappointed by this loss, it would prove to be his only election loss in his nearly 30-year-long political career. Most everything in his life seemed to be in place. He was a young, successful lawyer with his own practice. He was an altogether average man. He had only one eccentricity. Most nobody could squeeze a word out of him, and when they did, he made sure to speak in as few words as possible. Later in life, he earned the nickname Silent Cal. One popular story about Cal is that a woman at a dinner party made a bet that she could squeeze more than just 3 words out of Coolidge. When she told Coolidge about the bet, he replied quietly, in just 2 words, saying, "You lose." But one thing seemed to be hurting him more than any other. He was lonely, and desperately wanted a wife. One morning, as he was shaving, he heard laughter, which came from a woman, Grace Goodhue. who was spying on him as she watered the flowers in her front yard. Soon after, Grace sent him a pot of flowers, and he invited her for a date at City Hall. Grace was a remarkable woman. Straight out of college, she got a job at the Clark School for the Deaf in New Hampton. Grace would only ever teach here for a few years, but for her, this passion never died, and when she was First Lady and all throughout her life otherwise, she would advance the causes of the disabled. Calvin and Grace's date at City Hall was shortly followed by another, and another, and another more. And in October of 1905, just a little over a year after they first met, the two were married. After his marriage, Coolidge got right back to politics, and in 1906 he was nominated by the Republicans for a seat at the Massachusetts state legislature. He barely managed to win the election against his Democratic rival, but he did, and he went off to Boston for the 1907 session. Here, Coolidge was one of the most progressive Republicans in Massachusetts, supporting things like women's suffrage, as well as basically the whole of the progressive platform. Coolidge served just 2 terms on the State House of Representatives, but his short time in office was incredibly valuable, and all throughout, he made connections with more successful politicians and influential people who would help him one day to the presidency. One of the main reasons he retired from the House was because Grace had just had the second of their 2 children, and he wanted to be home instead of traveling all across the state to Boston all of the time. The first child, John, was born in 1906, and his little brother, Calvin Jr., was born just 2 years later. As soon as he returned home, he started campaigning for mayor of Northampton. He won 1 term and then another, but again, after just 2 one-year terms, Coolidge decided not to run for another term. This time, he set his sights higher instead of lower, and ran for the Massachusetts State Senate. His first 2 terms were very active, voting on and heading committees on issues like trolleys to strikes. He meant to resign once his second term was over, but seeing that the president of the state senate was getting ready to resign, he figured he'd try for a 3rd term and hopefully get the presidency this time. He won re-election, and he became president of the Senate, but only barely. This term was altogether not very notable, but one thing that would prove important to the course of his life in this year was just one speech. When he won election, he published a speech, "Have Faith in Massachusetts." This speech made him famous in Massachusetts, and after he won re-election to a 4th term in the Senate and a 2nd term as president of the Senate, many started to look to him as a potential candidate for lieutenant governor. In 1915, Coolidge ran for lieutenant governor alongside incumbent governor and former congressman Sam McCall. Coolidge and McCall won election after election 3 times. You see, in Massachusetts, the governor's term is only 1 year long, and the lieutenant governor has basically no power besides being a member of the governor's cabinet. These 3 terms were very quiet for Coolidge, but after McCall decided that he would not run for a 4th term as governor, Coolidge decided he'd run for the office. Coolidge and his running mate, Channing Cox, narrowly managed to squeak by and win the election. Coolidge was now governor of Massachusetts, and a test of leadership was just on the horizon. In 1919, the chief of the Boston Police Department learned of a plan by the police department to unionize. The chief was against this plan, of course, and would do most anything to prevent it from happening. The reaction from the police department was swift. Just 1 day after the chief posted a notice saying that any officer who joined a union would be seen as insubordinate, and then suspended the main union leaders, 3/4 of the Boston Police Department went on strike. The city was in complete chaos. There were riots, lootings, and violence everywhere, and of course there was no police department to put down these riots. The mayor of Boston, Andrew Peters, was trying his best to solve the crisis by calling in the National Guard of Massachusetts and firing the chief of police. But the mayor only really aggravated the situation. Now, this was an issue Coolidge must solve himself. Local government had proven practically useless, and the situation was getting out of hand. Coolidge quickly called in more of the National Guard. He restored the chief of police to his office, and he took charge of the police department himself. The chief, the moment he was given his office back, fired all of the striking police officers and started recruiting new officers immediately. Soon after the smoke cleared, the strikes ended, peace was restored. There were different reactions to his actions all over the country, but generally most were positive. It had established him as a bold, decisive leader, a law and order politician. Coolidge was suddenly being considered for the Republican nomination for president in 1920, but 1920 was still a whiles off, still another year away. In 1919, Coolidge won re-election as governor of Massachusetts, but unlike in 1918 where he barely scraped by with a little over 50% of the popular vote, this time he got over 60%. When the 1920 Republican Convention came to nominate a candidate for president, they knew they were really electing the next president of the United States. For the Republican Party was very popular and Democrats were not. Most anyone could see this election would be a massive Republican landslide. Among the other candidates, Coolidge was polling in 6th place, but he still held out a hope that he would be the presidential candidate. But word came that a dark horse candidate, Warren Harding of Ohio, would get the nomination. After hearing the returns back in Massachusetts, Calvin left his house to take a walk and hide his disappointment. Coolidge couldn't have the presidency, and though not yet nominated, Irvine Lenroot of Wisconsin would almost definitely get the vice presidential slot. The one shot he would probably ever have at the White House was now gone. But back in Chicago, with the convention, delegates began to shift their votes from Lenroot to a new candidate. Lenroot's certain shot at the vice presidency was now beginning to fade. Shouts erupted from the convention in support of a new candidate, Calvin Coolidge. One reporter would write that Coolidge's was the first real, wholly unpremeditated stampede that ever took place at a national convention. But Coolidge, back in Boston trying to cope with his loss, was now back from his walk, and he had no idea. Suddenly, around 8 p.m., Coolidge took a call. When he put down the phone and saw Grace looking back at him, wondering who was calling, he answered, "Nominated for vice president." Grace was shocked, saying, "You don't mean it, do you?" Cal responded, "Indeed I do." Grace then asked whether he'd accept the nomination, and Cal responded that, "I suppose I'll have to." Calvin Coolidge, after a great deal of uncertainty, was now the Republican candidate for vice president, and his and Harding's election was now a certain thing. 3 years later, President Harding was now lying dead in San Francisco, and the country was without a president. Coolidge had no way of knowing this. He was all the way across the country in Vermont. He was there, along with Grace and their sons, visiting Calvin's father, John Coolidge. The family had no telephone and no electricity. They were isolated from what was happening in the outside world and certainly had no idea of the situation in San Francisco. After dinner, the family went to bed on August 2nd of 1923. In the pre-dawn hours on the 3rd, John Coolidge was woken up by knocking at the front door. He was the only one awake at this point and went to answer it. On the porch was a messenger, and what he had to say was shocking. John then called out to his son and daughter-in-law. The moment Coolidge woke up, he knew exactly what was happening. There was no other reason why someone would be knocking on the vice president's door so far before dawn. Something bad had happened to the president. Before heading down the stairs, Coolidge dressed and then he said a short prayer. He was now ready for the greatest responsibility any man could ever have. Calvin walked down the stairs slowly, and there waiting for him was his wife, his father, and Congressman Porter Dale, who was then on the campaign trail in the nearby town when he heard of Harding's sudden death. Right then, a telephone line was being laid out so that Coolidge could call the Secretary of State. That wouldn't be ready for some time, though, and so Coolidge opened a copy of the Constitution and read Section 1 of Article 2. And though Coolidge knew very well the procedure of oath-taking, he'd like to refresh. Now only a few lines of oath separated him from the vice presidency, called the most insignificant office by John Adams when he held that same position, and the presidency, the most significant, magnificent, powerful, and respected office in all the world. Coolidge must have been terrified, having such a great responsibility just fall onto your shoulders and so unexpectedly, as an experience most would not be able to bear. But Coolidge faced this terrifying reality with the coolness and the, at least outward calm, that he had always had with him. By 2:30 a.m., the telephone line was ready and Secretary of State Hughes was on the other side. After a brief conversation, Coolidge learned that any swearing-in must be witnessed by a notary who would give the oath of office to the new president. The question now was who would give Coolidge this oath. Normally, it was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court who gave the oath, William Taft, who was a former president himself. But he was all the way down in D.C., and Coolidge didn't mean to waste any time. And then Calvin made a realization. His father, John Coolidge, was a notary. He could give the oath to Calvin. And so, at 2:47 a.m., in a dimly kerosene-lit room, for the first time ever, a father gave his son the oath of office. All on the family Bible, too. He woke up the next morning, and at 7:20 a.m., he stepped out the family home's front door to talk with the press. He had to get down to D.C., hopefully sometime soon, but before he could go board his southbound train, he had to make one more stop. He was driven to a small graveyard in his hometown so that he could stop and visit his mother's grave. Here, he found strength. Strength enough to make the long journey to D.C., and strength enough to finish the term that lay before him. When he reached the train station in Rutland, Vermont, he found that there was a special train there for the president and his wife. Instead, he and Grace took the 9:35 just like everybody else. Here, few knew who Coolidge was. They didn't know what he stood for and whether or not he had any role in the Harding administration's corruption. He didn't. But that he kept so quiet in almost everything, always keeping all conversation or any sort of talk to a minimum, meant that to most Americans, they just had no idea what to expect. More than anything else, most wondered whether he'd run for president himself and replace Harding as the Republican candidate in the 1924 election. On December 6, 1923, Coolidge gave his first State of the Union address. In this speech, Coolidge outlined the plans for and policies concerning the rest of his term, from immigration and agriculture, which are more home-ground issues, to the other side of the world in Russia and the revolution that was happening there. Coolidge carried on his progressive beliefs all the way from the Massachusetts State House of Representatives straight to the presidency. He was the president who made all Native Americans citizens of the U.S. Also, the scandals he inherited from Harding's administration seemed to evaporate and solve themselves as the Senate investigated any corruption, and cabinet members who were revealed to have a part in any corrupt dealings resigned on their own. Coolidge did not intervene. He let the situation run its own course, and it turned out the right thing, the best thing to have done. Suddenly, his popularity started to pick up where Harding's was dropping off steeply. He was being seriously considered as a candidate for president. He continued on with Harding's popularity, but he had literally no personal scandals, or any in his administration. Well, of course, he had some in his administration, but whatever he had was just sort of put on Harding instead of Coolidge, and that was the right thing to do because Coolidge just had no role in whatever corruption there was. Coolidge's image of a practical do-nothing was surprisingly popular. I mean, he was a do-nothing. He had a do-nothing outlook on the powers of the presidency, and that's not something I feel is criticism or even something negative. It's just the way he felt about his office, and ultimately, for his time, it was probably the best possible outlook. This made him incredibly popular, and when, just days before the Republican National Convention came into session, he signed into law a bill which would make all Native Americans citizens of the United States, his popularity, especially among Republicans, skyrocketed. Native American rights was one thing Coolidge seemed especially passionate about. probably because he thought he was part Native American himself, writing in his autobiography that his father's side of the family came with a marked trace of Indian blood. A good friend of his, Charles Curtis, was part Native American himself, and Coolidge would help him become vice president later down the line. Before he left office in 1929, Coolidge was made an honorary member of the Sioux tribe in South Dakota by Chief Henry Standing Bear. These Native American laws and policies were very popular, especially by progressive Republicans, which Coolidge was one of. 8 days later, the Republican National Convention, where the 1924 presidential candidate would be nominated, came together. They gave Coolidge a massive and easy win, being unanimously nominated over his two smaller opponents. For vice president was Charles Dawes of Illinois, who was the ambassador to the UK and for most of his career had been involved in economics and served in budget-related positions. It was a strong ticket, and Coolidge would almost certainly be elected. In July, as campaign season moved forward and after both he and his Democratic rival had been nominated, his son, Calvin Jr., got a blister on his toe while playing tennis. This would normally be nothing to worry about, but Washington, built on a swamp and being in the dead heat of summer, and its climate otherwise, got the toe infected. Soon this infection put Calvin Jr. in bed. He was running a fever and his life was at stake, and most nobody could do anything about it. As Charles Dawes passed Calvin Jr.'s room one night in early July, he saw the president sitting in front of his son's bed with a look of such agony and despair on the president's face, a level of depression and distress which Dawes had never seen before. On July 5th, Calvin Jr. was taken to Walter Reed Hospital, and the president and Grace Coolidge also moved there temporarily. But Calvin Jr.'s condition only got worse, and at 10:30, July 7th, cradled in his father's arms, the boy died. Coolidge was devastated. He was absolutely not in control of himself. Some said he was in control, but others, catching him in darker moments, said that he was in absolute agony. Even that he said that he would be dead soon, too, and join his lost son. Coolidge wrote in his autobiography that with the death of Calvin Jr., so died the glory of the presidency. Coolidge was president for under a year, but for that time and all throughout his life otherwise, he was energetic, exciting, and charismatic. Calvin Jr.'s death took that and crumpled Coolidge completely. On some days, he'd sleep for 16 hours at a time. Even 5 years later, Coolidge wrote only a few short lines about his son in his autobiography, too pained to write too much more, saying he was a boy of great promise and that he would have been a force for much good in the world. All this time later, he still blamed his son's death on himself, saying that if he had never been president, his son would still have been alive. But the fast pace of the presidency, and especially during an election year, wouldn't allow him to rest. He continued to campaign, but in a calm, even passive way. He didn't mention his opponents by name. He didn't do personal attacks. That just wasn't his style anyway. Luckily, he had Dawes do a lot of the campaigning for him as the vice presidential candidate, and he won big, really big, when election day came around. He won every single non-southern state besides Wisconsin, and nearly 17 million votes, 9 million over his Democratic rival. On Inauguration Day, March 4th of 1925, after parties and celebrations, Coolidge was given the oath of office by Supreme Court Justice and former President William Taft. Here, in the midst of the roaring 20s, everyone seemed excited at 4 more years of Republican leadership, but Coolidge looked forward on 4 more years in the office he felt trapped in, and privately, he dreaded it. After the ceremonies, Coolidge went back to the White House, preparing for 4 more years of agony.